Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn Kaza with Everbridge, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today's agenda focuses on how to effectively plan for an active assailant incident and mitigate harm before and after emergencies. We have two speakers for you today. Steve Cremando is the principal and founder of Behavioral Science Applications. He is a consultant and educator focused on the human element in disasters, mass violence, and other traumatic events. Mr. Cremando is a certified threat manager, a certified homeland protection professional, and a board-certified expert in traumatic stress. We also have Brian Tulin today, who is the Senior Director of Public Sector Strategy at Everbridge. Brian came to Everbridge after completing a 24-year career in public safety with the state of Connecticut. Before we begin, I have a couple housekeeping items. We'll be recording this session and making it available on demand after today. Also, we'll be accepting audience questions and we'll try to answer a few of them at the end of the session. If we're unable to get to your question, we'll be sure to have someone follow up with you directly. Okay, let's jump into the presentation. Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thanks everyone for making the time to join us today. As the title implies, this is probably not to be considered an active shooter 101 sort of program. Really, it's about where we are in the moment in terms of our current threat landscape. And to put it in very direct terms, we are in a very dynamic and a very complex threat environment, both here in the US and around the world. And this should really be informing your active shooter response posture and your workplace violence prevention efforts in general. If we think about where we are, this year, obviously, both here and globally, we are still struggling mightily with COVID-19. And the current surge we're having, the spike in the Delta variant, is also occurring right at a time of year when people are trying their best to get back to schools, get back to the workplace. And this is causing a lot of additional friction societally in terms of conflict between different points of views around vaccination, around masks, and so forth. So we're in a really, really sort of active environment in terms of high levels of emotion. But we've also seen that along with all these news stories we've had in the first half of this year about COVID, there have been a significant spike in a number of cases of workplace violence and active shooter cases here and around the world as well. The most current sorts of statistics tell us that we've actually had three of the most deadly workplace shootings over the last 40 years, just in the last 6 months alone. And we are actually seeing increased levels of violence in our communities. So we're in a really interesting place right now when we think about mass violence and we think about what steps each of us individually and organizationally can and should be employing. Now, these kind of numbers around societal violence do need to be held against the reality that crime statistics in general have been decreasing, really have been coming down over the years, and that's certainly good news. But they are up year over year. They are up over the last few years, and we know we're in an environment with, as I said, a lot of very powerful feelings and a lot that's going on. In fact, you may have seen just last Friday, the Department of Homeland Security issued a revised National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin. And one of the things that jumped out with me really is this focus on what was mentioned as grievance-based violence. And we're going to focus some of our attention on that as well in terms of understanding the constant changes in the active shooter threat and where we are today with this idea of grievance-based violence. One of the ways you could see that in action, for example, is if you think about the rare mass shooting that occurred in the UK over the last several days. The individual seems to have been an incel, a type of domestic violent extremist who is anchored around a very specific type of grievance, one that has to do with access to romance and sexual sorts of experiences. And this idea of aggrieved entitlement, the thought that the individual who has these thoughts and feelings feels in some way they're owed that by society. So grievance will be a part of our discussion today. And as you know, even with what's going on globally, what's happening worldwide, what's happening in the Middle East and Afghanistan in specific, we are in a very dynamic and changing threat landscape. So as a starting place, I'd like you to consider that our threat landscape is changing both in terms of insider threat and the possibility of outsider threat. Our current employees are potentially struggling with the effects, the mental health effects of a year and a half of the pandemic. They may be struggling with powerful emotions about return to work or their children returning to school. We know we have had increased rates of domestic violence reports and incidents during the COVID pandemic. And we also know that we are in a time where we've had record levels of civil unrest and very, very strong ideological feelings on both the very far left and far right ends of the spectrum. So we can have people who are insiders to organizations who actually are very motivated or inspired by some of those very powerful messages that are being generated from ideological camps right now. On the outside, obviously, when we think about the active shooter, one of the things that historically has defined active shooter has been random target selection. Well, that probably hasn't changed much. But in the time when we know that former employees and former clients, what we historically have called disgruntled employees, may be, very much affected by what's going on, and we actually may be working towards more former employees in those sectors that may be having some layoffs, or people who may be losing jobs if they're not willing or able to comply with vaccine mandates, things like this, that there can be some very strong feelings on the horizon around those issues, and certainly ideological violence from outsiders that may be targeted against our organizations of all different types. But as we think about the evolving landscape, one of the things that really will be important is trying to anticipate what the post-pandemic environment looks like in terms of precipitants and those sort of things that can stimulate or motivate and move someone towards an act of violence, like an active shooter situation. This is the time really to anticipate that sort of emotional reaction, fear, anger, and what we know is an increased level of distrust against authority. Now, that authority may be public officials, it may be the media, it can also be senior leadership in different companies. We also know that many employees and employers are struggling with issues around return to in-person attendance. For those who are going back to work in school, changing routines, including the potential grind of commuting. Very strong feelings we're seeing right now around mask compliance, vaccine compliance, and certainly just what we refer to in general as pandemic fatigue and the sort of psychological and emotional exhaustion that many people have been experiencing. We're going to circle back to this idea about grievance, though, in a few moments. Grievance is really kind of taken center stage as a precipitant in risk of violence. And we know that that's going to stem from many different things happening in a given organization, a community, and within an individual's own home and family. All of these, though, can lead someone to become more targeted in their potential risk of violence. These negative sentiments directed towards employers, to coworkers, and certainly towards governmental organizations. When we think about post-pandemic precipitants, we're all keenly aware of what the effects of 17 or 18 months of pandemic activity have included. And those were long periods of isolation, many people experiencing increased levels of financial stress, the closeness of working at home, with others working at their jobs from the kitchen table, perhaps children schooling from home at the same time. And tragically, the just catastrophic level of loss we've experienced in terms of the number of deaths resulting from COVID means that many people right now are struggling with issues of grief, loss, and bereavement. So all of these combined, including escalating rates of suicide risk, escalating rates of substance abuse, a whole range of behavioral problems that we know are associated with violence risk, are all percolating in this current threat environment. If we had to kind of take a snapshot of that, We know in some of the studies that have been done nationwide, we see very consistently about 53% of large survey populations talking about an increase in mental health sorts of complaints, including very generally feeling emotionally exhausted, and then going on to describe, more depressive and anxious sorts of reactions. But the other thing I do want to point out, and we know this from past public health emergencies as well as past pandemics, is these sort of emergencies have a very long behavioral health tail, which in plain language means once the disease itself has subsided, the emotional fallout very often continues for many years and actually increases. So you should not in some way figure that the behavioral response to COVID is going to settle down once the disease is abated. In fact, the more likely scenario is once the disease is under control in some way, the behavioral response is likely to tick up and continue at a pretty high level for a reasonable amount of time. And that potentially means years. So when we think about the relationship of active shooter to these different sorts of emotional states, we know from the research, this is from the FBI study of pre-attack behaviors back in 2018, mental health challenges are the leading form of stressor associated with this sort of risk. Now, we have to be super clear that when we talk about things like mental illness, we understand mental illness as a contributing factor, but not causal. That individuals with mental illness are no more likely to be violent than the average person in our community. But when we look at the statistics around active shooter, there is a very strong correlation that many people who go on to active shooting events have been struggling with mental health challenges. Where we are right now with the post-pandemic or the nearly post-pandemic environment really is telling us that people are struggling. All the surveys around pandemic-related mental health issues are telling us this is a very significant concern right now. So let's circle back for a moment. People with mental illness no more likely to be violent than the average Joe. In fact, they're more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators. But when we think about where people are, where they are with their stress level, if someone has been really struggling with mental health challenges, the additional stress can be a significant factor. So the other thing we could think about, and I've spoken about this often in other settings, there is a correlation between paranoia, some of the conspiracy theories that are swirling around us at the moment, and really the possibility of violence. We know that many acts of violence really are, I guess, motivated by a sense that the person feels threatened in some way or feels that revenge is justified and necessary. But I want to come back to this for just a moment. Grievance is recognized very clearly in the sciences around threat assessment as being the gateway to and the first step along a pathway to violence. Now, when you think about workplace violence, and you have to remember that active shooter events are very rare, isolated, but devastating forms of workplace violence, we also have to remember that as you're planning for violence, kind of active shooter preparedness and prevention, this should be seen as part of your overall violence prevention strategy, because many instances that begin at a lower level can escalate up to more serious violence. We also know that workplace violence comes at us from several different angles. Certainly the classic forms that OSHA recognizes of criminal intent, that from customers and patients, coworker to coworker, intimate partner violence, and so forth. All are part of that mix. But I do want to draw your attention to what we refer to as type 5 or ideological violence. So Fort Hood, the killings at Planned Parenthood in Colorado Springs, Charlie Hebdo, a number of these different events, again, San Bernardino, are instances where we have a collision or intersection of terrorism and workplace violence. Well, when you think about the landscape right now, we have seen the Homeland Security Threat Advisory landscape swing very hard towards attention to domestic violent extremism and away from foreign or international terrorism over the last year. But I don't know, in the current moment where we are, the goings on in Afghanistan and otherwise, that we will not see the attention swing back to international or foreign terrorism as well. So we really have the potential for ideological violence against institutions, organizations, and even businesses that can come from this sort of intersection between terrorism and workplace violence. But as I said, I want to come back to the idea of grievance. And the key concept of these kind of pre-incident risk indicators or warning behaviors. And today, again, in threat assessment, there's a lot of very sound literature that talks about a different set of both proximal, near-term, and distal, long-term indicators of this sort of risk. And we know, again, from the FBI study of pre-attack behaviors, that those people on a pathway to an active shooter event typically have clearly shown 4 or 5 different behaviors that other people have observed in the time period before the attack. So as part of our really maturing your workplace violence prevention and your active shooter readiness posture is really making sure that everyone in your organization is up to speed and turning up their awareness and their training on what these risk indicators look like and how we spot someone who may be on a pathway to violence early on and can turn them around, create an off-ramp where they get the sort of help that they need to prevent them from moving along further on this pathway. But as I said, I do want you to hopefully hold on to this idea that active shooter instances or events really should be seen in the context of a larger workplace violence spectrum of behavior, in which it's probably the final state, obviously the most devastating form, but maybe really preceded by milder behaviors, or what we see here as mid-range behaviors, before someone finally escalates. Nobody just snaps. This is a form of what we refer to as predatory violence that's premeditated, planned, practiced, and again, is a process of moving towards the violence. It is not someone who simply snaps. And because of that, there are other people around the shooter who can see this coming. When we look at where we are in the moment, and if you have not seen this, just a few weeks ago, the FBI released the most recent statistics for active shooter incidences, and it was the 2020 numbers. We did see a significant uptick in year over year, 2020 versus 2019, and a 100% increase from 2016. So unfortunately, the trend continues to tick up, and it has ticked up significantly this year in the first half of 2021. And we have, as I said, we're in a very, very complex and dynamic environment right now where we need to be in a very high level of readiness. Just to catch you up very quickly, if you haven't noticed this over the last year or so, the American National Standard for Workplace Violence Prevention and Intervention, originally a product of ASIS and SHRM, has been updated to now have an annex specific to active shooter preparedness. If you have not really brought this into your thought process, this is really part of our national, preparedness effort, and it's a standard. It helps us both in our safety, security, and defensibility of your decision makings in planning and preparing for active shooter threats. So you need to get square with this emerging or now evolving standard, as well as adjusting to where we are in the evolving threat landscape. So this probably means recalibrating and making some adjustments for Q3 and Q4, the rest of the calendar year, because we know we're going to be in a very mixed environment. You're going to have some organizations that probably have pronounced that they're bringing everybody back to work in September, who may be in the process right now of rethinking that, given the Delta variant spike. Schools reopening, again, public places, lots changing, and obviously, without departing onto a political discussion, how this looks across the nation is very variable depending on different states, different governors, and so forth. But you will have people in flux, and that creates an environment, again, with great variability and some degree, more unpredictability. When we think about people working from home, please remember that although it's someone's home, it's your workplace, and employers still have a clear duty of care for safety and security for people working from home in these alternate environments as well. So we're in a very interesting transition point that may create and open up some risk for increased violence. As we kind of move to the end of my slides and then move on to some of the great stuff Brian has to share with you, I want you also to be very vigilant about increased suicide risk and suicide risk in the workplace. We actually have had a significant uptick in suicide in the workplace over the last few years. And right now we're having, a pretty serious increase in depression, anxiety, and other sorts of factors that contribute to suicide risk. But when you think about this, it is actually part of the active shooter discussion, because that between a third and a half of all active shooter situations actually end with the suicide of the shooter. So the kind of barrier between suicidal and homicidal behavior is very fluid, it's very dynamic, and whenever we're assessing someone for risk of dangerousness to others, we're assessing for dangerousness to self and vice versa. So in kind of, moving beyond this, my recommendations for you then is to be constantly updating your active shooter posture because the risk environment is changing. You need to stay in touch with what's happening around the country. The landscape around domestic violence is very, again, fluid and dynamic. We need to be vigilant of what's happening on the international stage, and we need to be thinking about lone actors, the people who are either known or unknown to us, who may be motivated by a sense of grievance, again, even by some delusional sort of process in which they feel we have become their adversary or enemy. And what I strongly advocate for is a holistic approach, which is simply what we refer to as CASM. CASM is a comprehensive active shooter incident management approach, which is simply the application of the 4 phases of emergency management to the problem or the challenges of active shooter. And this is a dynamic process where we're always recalibrating, always adjusting to make sure we are aligned with the current threat environment. Kind of as my closing ideas for you before I pass the baton to Brian is on your desktop, please, at least these 4 documents related to active shooter. The ASIS a national standard, and again, the updated version in 2020 that has the annex around active shooter. The wonderful document by the FBI, Making Prevention a Reality, that starts to discuss even concepts of creating an upstander culture in your organization to give you more eyes on potential problems. The study of pre-attack behaviors, which is very informative, and of course, the most recent active shooter case studies and statistics from the FBI, which is the active shooter 2020 document recently released by the FBI. You always have a way to get in touch with me. This slide will be available to you, and you can reach back through myself or Everbridge if I can answer questions or share more information. But at this point, I'd like to pass the baton over to Brian to take it, deeper into our discussion about preparedness and response.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate it. Nice job on that. A lot of informative information. As we keep going on and how to critical event management kind of get involved in this entire process, just want to go through some short slides, just kind of walk you through not only what we're looking at, but ways that we can work with you and help you. So a famous quote that I love and I use quite often, the best defense is a good offense. Right, and everybody sells panic buttons, including Everbridge. We have a host of different solutions around this, and they're very effective, right? But they're also only effective for response. They're not all that effective when you're trying to mitigate the situation ahead of time, because again, they're a responsive device versus a proactive device. So, taking the offense side, we look at different SOCs and the way that they operate. We really need to have more proactive solutions, really around the identification and ability to simply respond to the incident. So when we look at risk intelligence, going through, as Steve mentioned, not only what's going on in your business or around your area or within your local jurisdictional area, but also around the country and then internationally, and seeing what's going on and understanding how the trends are working across the country. Then we get into things like the Internet of Things. So monitoring all your different capabilities within your environment, all in a single pane of glass. We talk about social media intelligence and being able to understand what's going on, what's being talked about, how that may impact your environment, your facility, and overall, what does it look like when your assets may be impacted. And then finally, kind of on the PSIM side of the physical security information management, is being able to bring all those different solutions into one environment. I'm not a salesperson, never have been. Worked in the government all my life before coming here, and I think I've been sold many different solutions over the years that require me to have yet another screen open, another system to monitor, and I can never bring all of those into one environment. Or flip side, I can be sold, this monster system that will, then give me a brand new camera that I don't really need to replace. It'll give me a brand new badge reader system that I don't really need to replace, and it'll do all these things that I really don't have a reason to replace what I have now, because these, can't all be integrated into one solution. So looking for those where, we can mitigate or migrate all of our current information into one simple solution. So great segue onto what goes on globally. So I took this snapshot yesterday morning. I was going through my system, and I was just looking at things that are being impacted around the world. The blue dots on the map are what's considered assets. So might be my different buildings that I own, might be my different company locations, could be different stores, it could be, whatever assets. It may just be my employees that are scattered around the globe. But then the red are threats. Those are things that are impacting my employees or my stores or my facilities. This is just a 1-day snapshot. So, this is yesterday, very active scene across the world. You'll see down, I pulled out some very specific ones, between a 7.2 magnitude earthquake in Haiti, shooting in Turkey, and then an explosion in Spain, right? These are all things that are impacting my business. But what more importantly, they're also impacting the social behavior of my employees. All of these led to some sort of death or some sort of negative impact in the world, right? And that typically is what's being broadcast around media, broadcast across social media. People are seeing this and ultimately has a social behavior change. So how will these affect your location? Also weather, when we're looking at that, we see, 5 or 6 different storms that are impacting different areas. You can see that they're impacting areas where there's heavy population. So a mitigation strategy is just to observe and watch and learn what's going on across the country. You'll see at the top, that was an alert that just happened to pop up as I was taking this screenshot that shows protests that were planned for yesterday in Mexico City. So again, a lot of negative impact on our assets and our employees, and how does that ultimately impact your operations and then your employees? Okay, so since I just talked about panic buttons and these type of solutions, I want to walk through, a very key scenario when we look at panic buttons. So we look at this, 11:15 p.m. and Nurse Jane just finished working her shift in the hospital. She's tired, she wants to go home. She's out in the parking garage, she's heading to her car, and she gets confronted by, a patient's family or another employee or somebody who, may or may not have her best interest in mind, right? So she's already activated her safety connection or her device, which is monitoring where she's going. It's monitoring to get her to her car and to get her home safely, and if she doesn't successfully make that, it's going to automatically launch a signal for help, which she can also override on her own if something's going on that she's uncomfortable with, right? So she activates her SOS button saying, I need help and I need it now. So what happens next? So immediately in our security center, it's sending off a distress signal. So our duty officer Jones in the dispatch center, he receives this message. It instantly pops up her location on the screen where she is in a, based on her location off her phone. It's also pulling up the nearest security camera so that we can see what's going on We can see right off her phone for a brief snapshot of time what's going on and what she needs for assistance. And allows us to respond appropriately based on the situation. Is this something that needs immediate police personnel? Is this something where we can just provide some security assistance and help her out? But overall, how can we respond to help her out and get her out of this situation? Right, so we're also going to kick off our SOP. This tells us that we have to send, some response assets out to her. So we're able to pull that footage into the system as well. Get her what she needs for help, maintain our SOP compliance, and make sure that we're following all the rules and regulations established by the company, because after all, the employee safety is our #1 concern. Right, so we know what happened. We have an alarm. The alarm went off. We've got all the details. We've got all the SOP information set up in the system and ready to go. We're monitoring what's going on from the high level. We've gotten, response assets out to that location. We took care of the situation. We mitigated. There was no harm, no foul. Everything is good. It was just an upset family member who was looking for more information. Okay, this could have gone south very quickly had she not been able to get assistance right away, simply by pressing a button or simply by letting the time lapse on her device, which stated, okay, well, if she doesn't respond within a certain time frame, we're going to auto initiate this response. Okay, if none of that happened, and it was just a conversation between an upset family member and a nurse, and the upset family member's not getting the answers they want, and it starts to escalate, and the nurse has no response or no capability to seek help, the situation could have turned much worse. Same can go for an employee situation. If it's an employee who feels that another employee has not been doing their share of the work, or they're upset because they used to date or some other issue is going on and they're no longer together, those situations can skyrocket very quickly. They can escalate faster than we like them to, right? And if we can't get them the assistance they need, if we can't get the help they need, ultimately we have a worse situation on our hands, and then that leads to a bigger problem. Right? So following all these directives, following all of the information, and again, in one common operating picture, we're able to provide our employees with the assistance they need while protecting their privacy and making sure that they're okay and their security at all times. So following our critical event management standards from assess, locate, act, and analyze, what are the 4 steps that we took? Right, so we enabled the employee to alert security quickly. We visually assessed the situation using the live video feeds that were brought in through the one platform. And then we reassessed continually the situation as it evolved. So as we got our first response out there, we assessed whether we needed more assets out there. We assessed whether it was escalating, we needed police out there. Ultimately, we were able to take care of all of that through an assessment. From the locate standpoint, okay, once the SOS button was initiated, the panic button was initiated, we were able to locate the employee. We were able to then locate the nearest security officer based on the dispatch center's view, and then be able to send other security team members as needed. From an ACT standpoint, we followed all of our proper SOPs. We were able to get all of the appropriate documentation completed, and then we were able to proceed in with a clear direction. We coordinated and communicated with the support from the response team, so we were able to keep our key stakeholders informed of what was going on. We were able to get our appropriate response assets out there, and we were able to quickly coordinate with any additional response assets we may have needed. Okay, and then from the analyze standpoint, we will also want to go back and we want to make sure that we reviewed all of our SOPs, all of our logs, identify any gaps in the response. Okay, leverage any after action report data to perform tabletop exercises, train security staff, and then adjust our alert severity and thresholds according to updated risk tolerance. Okay, so when we follow these 4 easy steps, okay, we now have the ability to complete this critical event management process and make sure our employees are safe and the outcome we're looking for has been achieved. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it back over and we'll go into questions and answers.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. So our first question is going to be for you, Brian. You're discussing using a mobile app, but how is privacy of the employee protected?
Okay, so privacy is always something that Everbridge looks at, especially with our mobile app. So when an employee downloads the mobile app, or whether you're sending it to, your phones for your employees, we're always making sure, number one, we're not, the system is not set up where it can monitor them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's only when they take an action and turn on the device. So, whether it's when they're using the app, you have different mobile settings. So if it's whether they're using the app and then it pulls their location when they take action. So they press a button, it pulls their location. What it's not doing is it's not sending back like a breadcrumb trail back to your security department saying, here's where Brian is right now. You okay with that? Here's where he is 10 minutes from now, or 10 minutes earlier. We're not doing that. So privacy is always being maintained for everyone who has the app downloaded.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Brian. The second question is for you, Steve. The question is social media playing a role in increasing the possibility of violence at work or school?
Well, I think it contributes. Important when we think about social media or any media in general, that these are contributing factors and not necessarily, necessary causal factors in violence. But if you think about, let's take one angle of that, something like the ability for people to move information, good information, bad information, misinformation, even rumors, never mind, conspiracy sort of ideas. In social media platforms, it's very much an unregulated sort of environment where people can share information very quickly. So when we think about what moves someone towards violence, the kind of emotions, the kind of ideas, social media certainly can contribute to that, can fan some of the flames, especially when we think about the idea I brought up earlier of type 5 or ideological violence. Certainly social media has played a role and will continue to play a role in people communicating and coordinating activities, or at least inspiring and motivating each other to take action. We also know, when we think about the larger environment of risk around extremist sort of violence, both from domestic sources or foreign sources, social media platforms have been a very effective method of recruitment and propaganda sharing. And what we saw just over the last few weeks actually was Al-Qaeda publishing their Inspire magazine online and publishing it and promoting it through social media again for the first time in probably about 4 years. So social media does really play a role, but it's important to realize that there's a lot of good we could do and a lot we could do to counter violent messages through social media as well. But it does play, Jocelyn, a significant part of the overall landscape.
Steve, I
Thank you,
have a
Steve.
question for you. So, we're talking about social media. I'm not a big user of social media. I'm more of a big follower, right? I'm what you probably call the stalker on there. So
That's
one of the
another
things I've
presentation,
noticed,
Brian.
what's that?
That's a whole other presentation.
Yeah, right. So, but one of the things I've noticed, and this is more from my background, on law enforcement and things of that nature, is the social media is not as bad as the comments that follow social media. When you go in and there's, 1,000 comments on either a CNN or a Fox News post, and, or any news post, for instance, it's the incitement within the comment section that I start to see more problematic. What are your thoughts on that? And, should the media play more a role in, limiting that by turning off the ability to comment and just have the ability to read an article?
So I think it's kind of a shared responsibility, Brian, and I certainly agree with you. When we think about social media and people's usage, the individual's usage, we're all familiar with this idea of the echo chamber, that we tend to subscribe to and repeatedly visit those social media platforms and those sites that reinforce our view. They're aligned with our politics or our viewpoint of what's going on. Then there's the news delivery, as you said, and then people's reaction, which certainly can fan the flames. The challenge is, and we're certainly struggling with this in the US because social media is still relatively young, is in an open democratic society that really places such a value on free speech, it's a tremendously tricky sort of endeavor to find that balance point between protecting public safety by not allowing, the sort of comments to go unchallenged or to be allowed to just remain posted that we know might move towards inciting people. And this goes as well for memes, which are, more visual, but the same thing, these messages that can really fan the flames. But the other part goes back, Brian, a little bit to things you shared earlier in your discussion, the responsibility of the organization to monitor open sources, to be aware of changing public sentiment and what's being said out there. And I know that's it's a very, very challenging endeavor because there's just so much that's floating out there at any given minute. But maybe, we're in a place right now where we're still, as I said, relatively new in social media, where we and society will kind of mature in how we share information, what we tolerate, what we leave posted, the responsibility questions you asked, responsibility of the media companies in policing that or allowing that, I think are still evolving. So much as we've spoken about with the theme of today's presentation about the evolution of the active shooter threat and our evolution of our current threat landscape, I think this is another place where we're still working through this. And it may be a generation or more until we really come down on a place that's more comfortable for us. But certainly I understand what you're saying, and I agree with that. It creates some very significant challenges and risks.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the good point, or one of the things I took away from that too, is the unchallenged responses that are in there. When a topic starts really going sideways and it's not factual information, or it's so far from factual information, people are trying to convince you of one way or the other, and there's nothing in there that's actually, kind of setting the record straight. I mean, we've seen this over the past 4, 5, 6 years, and we can laugh about fake news and everything else on there, but as people start to gravitate toward trying to convince you of their way or a different way, it's getting harder and harder to kind of see between that and understand, well, is it true? Is it not true? We're seeing that now with the whole politicization of the vaccine, and whether you should get it or not get it, and and what is the truthful information out there. I think a lot of times when I look at social media and I look at all the comments in there, you can clearly see where people are trying to sway an objection or an opinion one way or the other, and then as you go more into the active shooter role, and you look at how that's discussed, and how much attention is spent on the person who is the aggressor versus the victims and things of that nature. And again, you turn to the comments, you start to see where people are, rising up an active shooter to a situation where, they're more of a martyr now, and that's also, I think, turning, society in the wrong direction when it comes to how we respond to that. So I think that's important for a lot of employers to understand, number one, why did this shooting happen? What was the aggression behind it, and to be able to have some of these open discussions with their employees, just to kind of understand what the company's role in this was.
Yeah, and that's very complex. I've done a lot of work this past 2 or 3 years, Brian, helping programs, whether workplace violence programs or threat assessment teams in different environments, actually make the distinction between what is just a really strong opinion or an overvalued belief of someone who's kind of a true believer, and what actually may be delusional, and that delusion that actually may be, something symptomatic of a bigger, or a larger kind of problem or a risk in terms of an individual's mental health. So we're at a really, really tricky crossroads, and it's, it's a place where I think nationally and internationally, we are one time trying to create more diverse and tolerant environments in the workplace where we can have all kinds of people and all kinds of opinions coexist. And the other point where there are parts of the environment that kind of not only promote and encourage some extreme thoughts and beliefs, but actually applaud them and pour gas on those fires. And the other thing we know is online, especially, and even in our personal lives, some of the beliefs that people have are very tied to their values. And because of that, it gets really hard to argue with them because it's not a matter of facts for them. It's not a matter of, well, the science says this. It's really a matter of their value set, which is deeply held and probably goes back a significant amount of time in their life, and something that's relatively unshakable. So in these encounters or dialogues we have online where people maybe rise up and challenge beliefs or challenge statements, we're also really at a handicap that you're probably never going to really convince someone to change that opinion. So it is part of the very tricky evolving landscape that we touched on today. The current political and information environment as it combines and it intersects with the current risk environment. And that's part of why I said in some of my closing statements, finishing your active shooter plan, finishing your workplace violence plan is never a one and done where you fold it up and put it on the shelf. The threat landscape, including what you're addressing in social media, is ever changing. And I actually think we're at a point right now, at least temporarily, where that change is accelerating. So it's going to be super important for people who are concerned about violence prevention and active shooter risks to keep their finger on the pulse of a very wide range of information that's coming in, both about the domestic and international threat environment, and be vigilant, as I said earlier, to the landscape around people's thoughts and feelings about COVID and reopening and the issues around masking and vaccines and so forth. Super complicated, super fluid sort of environment that we're in right now.
Yeah, and don't ever take the approach or the thought process that it won't happen here. That's happened way too many times.
Yeah, that line of thinking's been disproven way too many times.
Yeah. It brings me back. I actually was doing a workplace violence, because at that point back then we weren't even talking so much of the active shooters. Back then we were talking more workplace violence. I was actually going to one of our state agencies to do a discussion and a topic on that, because they thought, well, it's possible, but we don't think it's going to happen. And sure enough, that morning before I even got there, there was a shooting situation in the state agency. So we can't ever sit there and assume it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and to that point, you're going back to one of my early slides that spoke about the new threat advisory from Homeland Security last Friday, and repeatedly in that statement and the statement in May from Homeland Security was this idea of grievance-based sort of violence. And if you think about just that word right now, there are probably more people than we've seen in quite some time who are harboring different forms of grievances. And you can think of so many reasons that people are walking around with some level of anger and frustration and the ability to project that on whoever they feel is to blame for the situation. So when you think about the fact that this can happen any place at any time to even the best prepared organization, I actually, as I said, not in the sky is falling sort of way, but we are in a very different place just in terms of that idea of grievance, who has them, what type of grievances they are, how intense they are, and how they actually may be motivators for violence. So it really reinforces your point, Brian, that there's not a place that is immune from being the target of those sorts of grievances or to have blame projected at them for being in some way connected to those grievances, that would have someone put their head on their pillow at night and saying, no, this we have no exposure to this sort of violence or this sort of risk. This is a universal vulnerability. And to your point, every organization and every sort of geographical area in the country and worldwide has some level of exposure to this risk. So we do need to keep our eyes on this. It's not a scenario that's going away. And I hate to say it, it has become more complex, as I mentioned, and dynamic. And I'd invite people to really be, assembling your violence prevention teams and your threat assessment teams more often right now, even absent of having cases, just to bring them up to speed with what you perceive to be the changing threat environment for your organizations and for your areas of operation, because they're very fluid right now. And I would anticipate they're going to continue to change as we move through COVID, we move through the political environment, the media environment, and what's happening both with international and domestic terror risks or extremist risks very, very interesting times we're living in at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you both so much for your insights. Sadly, we are approaching the end of the session, but as a reminder to everyone, if we were unable to get to your question today, we will be sure to have someone follow up with you directly. Also, this session was being recorded, so be on the lookout for the on-demand video and slides. If you'd like to learn more about how CEM can help with active assailant events and beyond, be sure to visit www.everbridge.com. With that, I want to give a big thanks to our speakers, Steve Corando, Brian Tulin. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.